And joining me in the studio to talk further about this is our science editor, Julia Seeger. Hello, Julia.
Hi, Annette.
We are talking there about biodiversity, but do we actually even know what it is? Because I think many of us actually have a false image of the whole concept. So what exactly does it mean?
That's right. And that's at least what Tatiana Giraud, she's a director at the CNRS here in France, says in her book, which translates into the attention that needs to be given to the living. And she says that we have to fight the cliches that we have when we think about biodiversity. Now, basically, most of us, when we think of biodiversity, we think of large mammals, tigers, lions, whales, and sometimes plants. But that's actually very far from the truth. The fact that insects, microorganisms, fungi, bacteria constitute most of the species that exist on Earth today and that are essential to the proper functioning of those ecosystems. So when we think about preserving biodiversity, it's not something static. It's not a collection of stamps, if you will. It's something that includes protecting all of these species, but also all of the interactions these species have together inside the ecosystem. So if you think of a forest, it's not just trees that are planted one next to the other. They can't live without fungi, without mushrooms. They can't live without birds that will disperse their seeds. And so we really have to think about it in a dynamic way, and the fact that it's not just big mammals. Now, since the dawn of time, species have had to survive to their environment that change all the time. They also have to adapt to other species that are also evolving in a sort of coevolution dynamic. And of course, they can reach a sort of breaking point when the species can no longer adapt because they don't have a habitat or because there's a lack of genetic diversity. And this is also what we're witnessing today.
Why is biodiversity and therefore ecosystems so important?
Well, because we're part of this world and we can't live without them. Once again, we maybe have to fight this idea that we live in this modern society, but we actually need those ecosystems for drinking water, food, wood, but also, of course, medicine. They provide us with so many different ecological services. They, for instance, are the ones who regulate climate. If you think about it, forest, but also rocks and oceans are huge carbon sinks. They also allow the pollination of plants. Without that, you don't have agriculture. You don't eat. They prevent epidemics. So if you're in an environment with a lot of different species, the pathogens can't spread because, of course, you're going to have some species that won't be effective carriers of the pathogen. They also protect us against flooding. And here we all think of mangroves, for instance. And there was this video that was posted here. You can see during Hurricane Ellen in Florida, and it shows you how much the mangroves are really protecting the coastlines and attenuating the power of the waves. So, of course, the question is who is responsible for all of this? And of course, in part, it's men because we damage all of those habitats through deforestation, through, of course, urbanization. There's also the overexploitation of certain resources, so we're going to overhunt or overfish. And we also pollute a lot of those habitats. So if you think about the pollution of the soil through, for instance, pesticides, what happens is that the plant is going to be toxic for its entire life. Then there's not going to be enough pollinators. The soil is going to be depleted from all microorganisms, and there won't be any worms to turn the soil around. That has consequences on agriculture, but also on our pharmaceutical resources. And so I said in part by men, because we can't forget that also there are natural factors that lead to the extinction of certain species. It can be the natural cycle of evolution, but it can also be natural epidemics. For instance, the golden toad of Costa Rica disappeared because of a fungal disease. But it's important to say that today scientists say that human activity is a huge enhancer today of this type of extinction.
Okay, so what leads to the extinction of certain species is disappearance of certain habitats, of certain ecosystems, and that's what we've seen with corn. But you've also got an example there that has been stinking out this studio for the last 20 minutes, and I think we need to talk about this.
So what we did with corn is that we selected different varieties that were adapted locally, and then we kept on planting the same stems, the ones that were the most effective. And then, of course, with time, we depleted that. We depleted the genetic diversity. And the same thing is actually happening with cheese, and this is a study that was made by Tatiana Giraud, the book I just told you about. And what happens is that for French cheese, we mature the cheese thanks to a fungi. So for, let's say, blue cheese, Roquefort, we use a fungi that's going to create blue spores that you have here. And it's actually true for camembert as well. So camembert and blue cheese, what's happening is that we've been using the same type of stem throughout the world. And today, when it comes to blue cheese, for instance, they're all made of the single clonal lineage of molds. So what this means is that you have a depletion of the diversity, and so hence you only have this one that's been used for all blue cheeses around the world, except in the city of Roquefort in Normandy, because there's an AOP label that has been protecting them. So it could actually go extinct. This is really important. Now you have to understand that all of these deleterious actions, they're made by men, but also because not because they don't want to eat cheese anymore, but rather because they tend to not really understand how biodiversity works. And what's interesting is that we talk a lot about climate change, and most of the actions that we do can actually be deleterious towards biodiversity because we tend to think about them as something very separate and not linked. So let me just give you some examples, and there are thousands of them. But in the UK, they wanted to enhance, for instance, the strength of carbon sinks. So, for instance, wetlands. So they planted trees, but of course the trees dried up the wetlands, and then the wetlands released all of the CO2 that they were storing. We wanted to replace gas and coal to reduce CO2 emissions. Well, the wind turbines have also increased the mortality of migratory birds. And the same goes for dams for hydroelectricity. It blocked literally fish migration. So the point here is really to say that a good action for climate change is not always a good action for biodiversity, and we really need to have a more holistic approach. And that's the message that a lot of scientists have for the leaders who are actually at COP.
Indeed, thank you so much for that. And it's all interconnected, as you stressed there. Thank you, Julia Seeger, our science editor.